Welcome. This is going to be the second and final part for the human rights series. So in this particular video, we're going to be focusing on the human rights issue in Australia. There are about 5 that you can choose from the textbook, but for the purpose of keeping this video nice and short and sharp, I'm just going to be focusing on one human rights issue, which is the right to vote. So I think just make sure you check with your teacher if you get the option to choose, or obviously if they've assigned one to do for you, make sure you follow that particular one. The big important part about this video that will apply to everyone though is the skill of evaluating the ways in which human rights are protected in Australia. So the skill we are working towards at the end of this video is how can we discuss the strengths and weaknesses of human right protection in Australia, but in a lot of detail. And I'm going to talk you through how to structure it and make sure you get the full marks for a potential question on your assessment tasks. So first of all, right to vote is pretty straightforward. It is known as the right to suffrage, and what that involves is allowing people to choose their leaders that represent their views and values. So in Australia, we have a principle of what's known as representative government, and we did this by having elections every 3 years, roughly, for federal. And that basically allows us to vote out people that aren't, doing a great job, and it keeps everyone in Parliament very accountable to make sure they're consistently and continuing to uphold the views of the majority in Australia. So how it's developed over time in Australia is that in 1948 we signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We've got the right to vote in international right laws as well and agreements in 1966. And we've also kind of embraced certain treaties to ensure we really protect our right to vote. So in Australia, I guess what I'm trying to get at by this slide is it's very, very well protected through multiple mechanisms, and the ability to vote for who you want to represent you is very, very unlikely to be taken away because of how protected it is in Australia throughout history as well. So it's protected through 3 main ways: statute law, which is known as parliament-made law; the Constitution, which is that old sort of original document we talked about in the last video; and then also it's protected through courts or common law. So the first one you need to know how it's protected in statute law is through what's known as the Commonwealth Electoral Act. So why this Act of Parliament is really, really important is because it makes voting compulsory for everyone over the age of 18. Obviously, it's important to know that there are some people that are disqualified from voting or that aren't allowed to vote. So people that maybe have serious mental health conditions, people that have been found of guilty of really serious indictable offences, prevents those people from voting. So I guess a big point, some other countries it isn't compulsory, but in Australia you have to vote, and you do face a punishment or a fine if you do skip the voting process. Next way it's protected is through our Constitution. So these are 2 really, really important sections you should remember for your assessment task. It's section 7 and section 24 of the Constitution. And basically, if you were to open that Constitution and go to these sections, it basically says that members of the House of Representatives, which is our lower house in federal parliament, and the Senate, which is our upper house in parliament, they must be chosen directly by the people. What that means is that people who are in these houses of parliament have to be chosen by us. We kind of have that embedded in the Constitution that helps ensure we protect what's known as representative government. So why that's really, really important is because it is in the Constitution, it's very, very difficult to remove, and it really pretty much helps guarantee that we'll always have the right to choose who we want to represent our views and values overall. And lastly is what's known as common law. So when cases do go to court, judges are able to resolve those cases, and they can make what's known as precedent or laws, which helps to strengthen voting rights in the future. So the case we're going to be focusing on for this video is what's known as the Roach case, and it's a case involving allowing more prisoners the opportunity to vote. So the High Court has been a big player in advocating for more rights as well for Australian people, and that was really clearly seen in this case study here, which we're going to go through. So if I just direct you back to the start of the study design here, you can see that we've gone through the first 2 kind of areas here. But it is really important that for this particular SAC, you do know an example of one case study in relation to whatever human rights issue you do pick. And you just need to really focus on what the case study is and why it was so important in terms of human rights. So the case we're looking at is what's known as the Roach case. It occurred in 2007, and basically, to give you 3 quick overview summary points about what happened in this case, is that Roach challenged the ban on prisoners being denied the right to vote. The High Court stepped in and said that banning all prisoners was unconstitutional. And the big outcome of this case is that prisoners serving less than 3 years regained the right to vote, which was previously lost as a result of the law. But obviously for your SAC, you probably need to know this case in a little bit more detail. And I'm going to break it down into, 4 main sections. So what were the facts of this case? The facts of this case is that the Commonwealth Electoral Act prevents anyone from serving a prison sentence of over 3 years from voting. In 2006, they basically updated this law and they said they wanted to prevent anyone from serving a prison sentence from voting. So it basically meant every single prisoner was now unable to vote. And then the last thing is that this particular prisoner at the time was serving a 6-year prison sentence, which she wasn't allowed to vote at all. And she felt that she was personally affected by the law. So she wanted to go and challenge it in the High Court to see if we could get this particular law that was introduced removed. So what happened next, and I guess why it was a legal issue, is because we talked about in that previous slide, is that these 2 sections here, which are really, really important, section 7 and 24, says that people in our parliament are meant to be chosen directly by the people. And it's kind of stressing the point that, we are taking out quite a large number of people from being able to vote, and she was kind of stating that we should have the implied right to vote, and that this particular law banning all prisoners is kind of restricting or inhibiting us achieving representative government, because you're taking thousands and thousands of people who might like to vote as a prisoner and just denying them that right. So that's kind of an overview about why it made it to court in the first place. So in terms of the decision, it actually did find in favor of Roach, or the prisoner that was serving 6 years, and they deemed that the law was unconstitutional. So the Constitution basically establishes a system of representative democracy and elections. So like we have kind of stressed that we do have those federal elections every 3 years, we do have those 2 sections in the Constitution that says that people in Parliament must be chosen by the majority. So obviously, to be a true representative, we need a substantial majority of the population being able to have the ability to vote. We don't want to try and take people's ability away to vote unless we really have to. So it basically said that the Commonwealth can determine who can and cannot vote in these elections within reasonable limits. So what that kind of means is, obviously for your really, really serious offenders, maybe like your serial killers, for example, that's a fair enough or a reasonable reason to stop someone from voting. And it basically said that removing the right for all prisoners to vote is excessive. And they just decided to say that only those convicted of a serious offense should be denied the right to vote. I guess you can kind of think of it as like an indictable offense. Those who have committed an indictable offense should be denied the right to vote. So what did this case do in terms of our rights? It did a couple things. The immediate impact is that it got rid of the law restricting all prisoners from voting, and it went back to how it was before that 2006. So it basically meant that in this next slide here, is that the Commonwealth can exclude people from voting if there is a substantial reason. So you can see some of the reasons there, but still it does sort of showcase that some people still are not allowed to vote as prisoners, as mentioned. And lastly, the Constitution does not include a personal right to vote, as it can be removed for limited circumstances. And this is one other key point, is that there is no implied right to vote. And we were thinking maybe we might have got a second additional implied right from this case, but we still only just have the one implied right, which is the freedom of political communication. It didn't give us an additional right as a result of this case. So that's a really good quick overview of this case. I guess the point I would stress is you really need to sort of focus on these last 2 slides. They're probably where the marks lie, which is like the decision of the case and the impact. I guess a lot of people in the SACA assessment might spend too much time talking about all the facts. What's more so important is the significance of the case or the impact of the case. So moving on to reforms to voting rights. So this is the next kind of dot point under the voting section here. I guess just want to start off by saying is that when you see the word reforms, this word reform simply means changes, or how can I change something? So if I'm trying to reform a system, I'm simply trying to change it. So there's been two suggestions about how to change voting, and this is directly from the textbook. The first one is that some people have argued that we should lower the voting age. Some people saying 14-year-olds should be able to vote, 16 should have the right to vote, because I guess a lot of people, have a lot of strong opinions, and it's unfortunate that sometimes they have to wait till 18 to be able to influence who they want to vote for and that sort of thing. So this is all about allowing those younger people to vote. And secondly, the second reform we have is allowing all prisoners to vote. So like I said in that previous couple slides, is that as soon as you've serving a 3-year prison sentence or more, you're restricted from voting altogether. A lot of people have been saying that, we should just allow all prisoners to vote to be a true representation of Australia's views and values. So the second part of this one is that what are the downsides of doing this, and what are some of the I guess negative opinions or problems with changing those two particular things I just mentioned? Well, the first one is that a lot of people argue that young people lack life experience and they're not going to be able to, I guess, cast an informed vote. So I don't really know how true that is. I feel like young people definitely could. It's a bit of a generalization, but that's kind of the argument as to why people don't want to change it to a younger age. The second one is that with the prisoners, a lot of people will argue that the punishment is that they should be serving a prison sentence and they should be denied certain rights and liberties, including the right to vote. So they believe that that's a justified take away that right to vote. And I guess one final thing I wanted to add about both of these is that remember that people in Parliament are there to represent the views and values. So a lot of members of Parliament are scared to introduce changes like these two here because they don't want to introduce something what's known as controversial or a bit, it might get a lot of backlash or they might lose a lot of support as a result of something controversial. So I guess some ways I can link that to more current things is, for example, same-sex marriage. That wasn't made legal until 2017 in Australia. A reason why it took so long to introduce is because it was seen as quite a controversial topic. So a lot of people in Parliament were scared to introduce it because they were worried about losing, I guess, voter support. Alrighty, so now onto the final part of this video. So in this part, I really want to focus on the evaluate key skill. So I guess when you do see the word evaluate, what's really required from you is to give a really detailed overview of both sides. And it's very similar to doing the discuss task word, except the biggest difference we're looking for if you are given evaluate is you need to make sure you have an introduction and you need to make sure you have a conclusion. So I know a lot of people might not like English as a subject, but it's a really good way to think of it as like a mini English essay talking about how rights are effectively protected and how they're not so effectively protected. And I guess you should always try and focus on a minimum of 2 when you're evaluating, and you can choose from the Constitution, the Charter, and both statute law and common law. So to get stuck into the strengths to get started off with, it's really important you remember, I'd guess maybe like 2 to 3 to give you enough understanding to write a proper evaluation. So firstly, as we've kind of talked about, we have said that protections in the Constitution are difficult to change as they're entrenched or written in the Constitution. So just as a little recap here, I've got this diagram here in the top corner. Remember that a referendum vote requires more than half of Australian voters to agree to a particular change, and also 4 out of 6 states also agreeing to a particular change. So because of this process of having to remove them with a referendum, they're very, very well protected. In this sort of strength, you can talk about the fact that we have 5 express rights, such as freedom of religion, and obviously with this referendum process, they're very, very well protected. Moving on to our next strength is all about statute law. So Parliament, their main job is to make law. What they can do is they can create new legislation or they can even amend or update existing laws to incorporate further rights. So this is known as statute law, and they're likely to continue to pass laws that uphold our views and values and promote our human rights because of this principle of representative government, which we looked at previously. Their whole job is to represent the views and values of the people. So they'll probably continue to make really effective laws that enhance human rights. Thirdly, we've got that courts are independent of Parliament, so they don't face any pressure from the people like you see in Parliament. So they're able to establish precedent, or otherwise known as laws, to enhance the protection of the rights. So this is a really good strength where you can use the Roach case that we looked at in a couple slides ago. And that was all about promoting and enhancing the right to vote for prisoners. So a really good chance to use that when you talk about the courts as a strength. And the last one is that another link to the Constitution is that we can get more rights, known as implied rights, if people are willing to take it to the High Court. So currently, just remembering, we only have one implied right, which is the right to freedom of political communication, but we can gain more if people are willing to take it to court. So I guess when you are looking at these strengths here, just remember that these are kind of a really brief summary of each of the strengths. And in an evaluation, you'd want to try and write these in a little bit more detail than what I have, but I'm going to show you a sample paragraph about how to do so. Moving on to the weaknesses, pretty similar. I've linked them all up with the first weakness, second weakness, and the first strength, second strength. So with the first one, it is very good that express rights are protected by that referendum process, but this can also be seen as a negative, because if, for example, we wanted to add a sixth express right or a different express right, the only way we can do that is through that referendum process, which we've kind of talked about already as being very hard to achieve. So that's kind of a weakness of our Constitution. A second one is about common law. So courts cannot make law on what's known as their own volition, or they can't make law by themselves. They always have to wait for a case to be brought before them before they can make law. So unlike Parliament, they can make law as they please when they're sitting. Common laws have to wait for a physical case to come in front of them. And for the most part, it's very, very costly and very, very time consuming to go to something like the High Court. You might have looked like something like the Marlborough case about land rights in Australia in legal studies in year 11 this year, and that case alone took 10 years to resolve in the High Court. So it's a bit of a weakness of common law or courts in protecting our rights. Thirdly, we have Parliament, which is our supreme lawmaking body. They can actually make or amend laws that cancel or restrict our human rights. Whilst it is very unlikely they would do this, it is still a possibility. And if they did potentially make a law that restricts our human rights, the law needs to be amended and go through a whole kind of process to get that amended. It has to be passed through both houses of Parliament to make that original amendment to get it back to how it was. So very unlikely this particular situation, but it is important to recognize that they could potentially restrict our rights. And last is that constitutional rights are very limited. As I mentioned on the other slide, we only have one implied right, and that whole process of having to take something to court being very time consuming and costly means it's probably unlikely that we will get any more implied rights. So now that I've presented you with the kind of strengths and weaknesses, we're trying to focus now on how do we actually write this in a paragraph. So you might be lucky enough to get just a discuss question, for example. So if you just get a discuss the ways in which rights are protected, you only have to focus on the strengths and the weaknesses and just have 2 paragraphs. But with evaluate, we're going to look at doing an introduction first, giving us an overview about what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to show you a sample intro that you might like to use in your answer. So I've started off by saying in Australia, human rights are protected through multiple mechanisms. And I've said that they're protected through the Constitution, statute law, and common law, because that's what I'm going to be talking about in my evaluation. So I'm introducing what I'm going to talk about in my introduction. I'm acknowledging that these particular 3 things that I've highlighted do have some drawbacks or some weaknesses, but overall, our human rights are very, very effectively protected in Australia. So I'm giving us a really broad overview about what I'm going to talk about, and also acknowledging that I'm going to be talking about both strengths and weaknesses. So to give you an idea about how that would look like in a paragraph, you could definitely use more detail than what I've got here, but it just really depends how many marks your question is. So if your question is 10 marks, you might like to do either 3 short and sharp strengths and weaknesses, or 2 really detailed strengths and weaknesses, but it all depends on the mark allocation. So this is just here to give you kind of a guide how to talk about it. So in your evaluate or discuss, always really important to start your sentence with one strength or one advantage, because you're letting the reader know that you're starting on the positive. And I've said, is the protections in the Constitution are difficult to change. In Australia, express rights are entrenched. And that whole idea talking about that they can't be removed without a successful referendum. If you wanted to take this point a little bit further, you could mention that we have 5 express rights, mention a specific one, like the trial by jury right or the freedom of religion right, for example, and explain how it's so protected because of this process here. A really good sort of point you can add in is always talking about, this referendum process, and, that requirement of having 4 out of 6 states and a majority of Australia is really hard to achieve. So therefore it's very, very protected. Secondly is with this one here, this is the weakness for the Constitution. So I've said that, it is very difficult to add express rights due to that referendum process. You can pause and have a read of my paragraph here. But what this basically means is, like, as our views and values change, we might want to update our express rights, but because of that really harsh process of a referendum, it's very hard to do so. A really great statistic you can use when you are talking about the Constitution as well and the referendum process is that only 8 out of 45 referendums have been successful, really indicating how hard it is to actually pass a referendum. From here, you're just looking at doing the exact same process again with either a second or a third paragraph, depending on how many marks your question is. So you might next pick to talk about statute law, talk about the strengths of statute law and the weaknesses of statute law. And then if it's quite a long question, do the same thing for common law, strengths, weaknesses. And then finally, your last part should be a conclusion. Just summarize your key points, what you have talked about, but very important, don't introduce any new ideas. Kind of just like a bit of a wrapped up experience. What have you been talking about and what are some of the key points you've highlighted? So to conclude this series, a couple key things. Firstly, just make sure you know about the importance of the right to vote or your chosen human rights issue. So obviously the human rights issue you have done in class or the one I've shown you here, you do have to know it in quite a lot of detail. Make sure that when you do see the word evaluate or discuss, you are always thinking in your head, I need to think about both sides or the strengths of weaknesses. And just use my sort of strengths and weaknesses as a guide. But just remember, they are summarized points. Probably would expect you to go in a little bit more detail than the dot points there. And lastly, just remember the focus of having a specific case study to talk about. So as we mentioned, the Roach case for the voting one, that can be used in your evaluation. It might be given to you as a question by itself. So it's really important that you are aware of the case in detail, but more so the significance. So I really appreciate you tuning into my videos this year. All the best with the rest of the year, and good luck if you are doing Year 12 legal studies next year. Thanks for watching. Cheers.